4 unanswered texts. That is what it cost a marriage, a family, and eventually, a man's entire future. While Theo Callahan was switching off his phone in a downtown Toronto hotel room, his wife was sitting alone in the emergency bay of Sunnybrook Hospital, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. She had been calling him for 40 minutes. She had left 2 voicemails. She had sent 4 texts, each one more desperate than the last. The last one read simply, "Please Theo, I need you." He never saw it. Or rather, he chose not to. Theo was 34 years old, a senior project manager at a mid-sized construction firm called Alderton Group. He was the kind of man who made a good first impression. Broad shoulders, easy laugh, the sort of confidence that comes from never having faced a consequence he couldn't charm his way out of. His wife, Mara, was 31. She had a master's degree in environmental planning, a quiet competence about her, and a laugh that her father always said could fill a room without trying. They had been married for 6 years. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Ellie, who collected smooth rocks from the banks of the Credit River, and kept them in a shoebox under her bed like treasure. Ellie was why Mara had been in that emergency bay. It had started at dinner. Ellie had eaten half a granola bar from a new brand Mara had picked up at the farmer's market that Saturday. Within 20 minutes, Ellie's lips had swollen. Then the hives came, spreading up her arms like a map of something terrible. Mara had grabbed the girl, grabbed her bag, and driven to Sunnybrook with Ellie crying in the back seat saying her throat felt like a sock. Mara called Theo from the car, no answer. She called again from the triage desk, no answer. She sent the first text while a nurse was checking Ellie's oxygen levels. She sent the second while a doctor was explaining what anaphylaxis meant. She sent the third and fourth in the 20 minutes that followed, during which Ellie was given epinephrine and placed in a monitored bay with a mask on her small face, and an IV in her arm that was too large for her. Theo's phone was in the pocket of his jacket, which was draped over a chair in room 318 at the Hazelton Hotel on Yorkville Avenue. He was not at the client dinner he had told Mara about. There was no client dinner. There had not been a client dinner on any of the 7 Thursdays he had claimed to attend one. He was with a woman named Fiona, 29, a sales rep at a rival firm, who wore a perfume called Cedar and Bloom, and who had been, for the past 4 months, receiving the attention and presence that Mara had slowly stopped receiving without quite knowing why. Fiona was the one who silenced the phone. She had seen Mara home light up the screen 3 times, and she had finally reached across the nightstand and said, without looking at Theo, "Do you mind?" Theo had taken the phone, looked at it once, and pressed it face down onto the nightstand. "She'll be fine," he said. "She just can't handle things on her own." He turned the phone off at 9:47 p.m. At 9:52 p.m., Ellie went into respiratory distress. The team moved quickly. A second round of epinephrine. A pediatric specialist paged. Mara stood outside the bay with her back against the hallway wall, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to call Theo one more time on a borrowed phone from a nurse named Sandra who watched her with the kind of quiet heartbreak that only people who have seen real desperation can recognize. The call went to voicemail. "Theo," Mara said, and her voice was barely a voice at all. "Our daughter is sick, she can't breathe. I need you here." She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the linoleum floor. Sandra sat beside her without being asked. They waited. At 11:30 p.m., a doctor told Mara that Ellie had stabilized. She was sleeping. She would need monitoring overnight, but the crisis had passed. Mara thanked her. She walked back to Ellie's bay. She sat in the chair beside the small bed and held her daughter's hand, the one without the IV, and did not cry. She was too far past crying. She stared at the screen of her phone and at the row of unread messages she'd sent into nothing. And then the door to the bay opened and Theo walked in. He had showered. His hair was still slightly damp at the temples, and there was the faint trace of a different soap on him. Something cedar adjacent, not the Irish Spring he kept on the shelf at home. He was wearing a clean shirt. He had clearly stopped somewhere before coming. He looked at Ellie and his face arranged itself into appropriate horror. "Oh God," he said. "Mara, I'm so sorry. My phone was on silent. I didn't see any of it. I just got the voicemail and I came straight here." "Is she?" "She's stable," Mara said. "Thank God." He reached for her shoulder. "Don't," she said, quietly, without drama. He sat in the second chair and they did not speak for a long time. Mara's father arrived at midnight. His name was Conrad O.C. He was 63 years old and he had driven 40 minutes from his house in Oakville without being asked. Because Mara had sent him a single message that said Ellie was sick. "She's okay now. I'm at Sunnybrook," and Conrad had not even changed out of his reading clothes before getting in the car. Conrad was not a loud man. He had spent 35 years as a forensic auditor for the federal government and then another decade as a private consultant. He had testified before parliamentary committees. He had dismantled the financial architecture of 3 separate corporate fraud schemes that had collectively defrauded Canadian taxpayers of over $90 million. He was the kind of man who spoke in full sentences and listened like he was taking a deposition. He had never once raised his voice in an argument because he had never needed to. He walked into Ellie's bay and kissed his granddaughter's forehead. He looked at Mara, at the hollowness under her eyes, at the way she was sitting slightly turned away from Theo, like a body oriented toward an exit. He looked at Theo and said nothing, but he saw. Conrad always saw. In the hallway, while Theo went to get coffee from the machine near the elevator, Conrad stood beside Mara and asked her simply what had happened. She told him about the calls. She told him about the texts. She told him that Theo had said his phone was on silent. Conrad nodded once, slowly. He came straight from the client dinner? Mara looked at the wall. He said so. Conrad looked at his daughter. She was her mother's daughter in so many ways, her patience, her dignity, the way she swallowed pain and kept moving. But she was also his daughter, and Conrad had not spent decades reading the fine print of falsified documents without learning to recognize the face of someone who suspects the truth, but cannot yet say it out loud. Okay, he said gently. He did not say anything else. But something behind his eyes had already begun to move, quiet and purposeful, like a wheel turning in a locked room. The weeks that followed had the particular cruelty of normalcy. Ellie recovered. Life resumed. Theo bought flowers and a new pediatric allergy kit and made a big show of reading the labels on Ellie's snacks. He was attentive in the performance of it, and Mara watched the performance and felt something cold settle in her chest that she couldn't name and didn't yet want to. She started noticing things. The way Theo sometimes glanced at his phone and then set it face down. The way he was vague about Thursday evenings. The way he smelled different when he came home late, not like a job site or a client dinner, but like a different kind of evening altogether. She didn't say anything yet. She was her father's daughter, she gathered. Conrad meanwhile had made a phone call. He had a former colleague, a woman named Bernadette who had spent 20 years in federal investigations before retiring to run a small private consultancy in Mississauga. Bernadette owed Conrad 2 favors, old ones, the kind people don't forget. Within 10 days, she had given him the outline of a picture that Mara had not yet let herself look at directly. Theo had been using Alderton Group's expense account to cover hotel rooms, restaurant dinners, and a gift from a jewelry boutique on Cumberland Street. The charges had been coded as client entertainment. Conrad looked at the dates. 7 Thursdays. 7 times Theo had described client dinners that Alderton Group's actual client roster could not account for. Conrad cross-referenced the hotel charges. Hazelton, Hazelton, Hazelton. Again and again, the same hotel, the same Yorkville address, on the same evening that his daughter's daughter had been fighting to breathe. Conrad closed the folder. He made himself a cup of tea, the strong Ghanaian kind his mother had made, and he sat at his kitchen table for a long time. He was not angry in any way that would show on his face. What he felt was something older and quieter than anger. It was the specific grief of watching someone you love be disrespected by a person who had shaken your hand at a wedding and meant nothing by it. He thought carefully. He thought about timing. He thought about what Mara needed and what she would need 6 months from now, and what a man like Theo would do if cornered too early. Then he opened a new folder and began to build. Alderton Group was not a small company. It had contracts with 3 municipal governments in the Greater Toronto area, and had recently tendered for a major infrastructure project in Hamilton. A combined drainage and greenway development worth $42 million. Theo was the internal lead on the Hamilton bid. It was the project that was going to make him a partner. Conrad knew people in municipal procurement. Not because he had cultivated them for this purpose, but because 35 years of federal audit work leaves a person with a wide and deep network of people who trust their judgment. He made a few careful, quiet inquiries. What came back surprised even him. The cost projections Theo had submitted internally for the Hamilton bid had been manipulated. The materials line had been inflated by roughly 22%, with the excess earmarked through a subcontractor that existed on paper and nowhere else. It was a quiet skim, the kind designed to be unnoticeable inside the noise of a large project budget. The subcontractor's registration documents traced back, through 2 layers of a numbered company, to an account that Theo had opened 18 months earlier in a credit union in Burlington. He was stealing from his own employer, tens of thousands of dollars, staged across multiple invoices, invisible unless someone was looking for it. Bernadette confirmed it in writing. She attached supporting documentation. She noted that the paper trail was clean enough to present to the RCMP Commercial Crime Section. Conrad read the full report on a Sunday afternoon while Ellie napped upstairs in his guest room. Mara was in the kitchen making tea. He could hear her moving around, the small domestic sounds of his daughter in his house, and he thought about the version of this conversation he would need to have with her soon. But not yet. Not until the ground was prepared. Alderton Group held its annual partner announcement dinner every November at the Carlu in downtown Toronto. It was a formal event, black tie, speeches, the kind of room where careers were made official. This year, the invitation had specified that Theo Callahan would be recognized for his leadership on the Hamilton bid and elevated to senior partner, effective January 1st. Mara had bought a dress. Ellie had helped her choose it over a video call, a deep green that Ellie said looked like a forest. Theo had been visibly proud of himself in the weeks leading up to the dinner, in the way that men who believe they have gotten away with everything sometimes are. Conrad received an invitation too. He had been a quiet advisor to Alderton's founding partner, David Alderton, for years. A relationship predating Theo's time at the firm by a decade. David trusted Conrad's judgment in the way that people trust the advice of someone who has never once been wrong about something that mattered. On the morning of the dinner, Conrad called David. He said he had some concerns about the Hamilton file. He said he'd prefer to address them before the evening's announcements, to avoid any embarrassment to the firm. David was quiet for a moment, then, he said, "Come to the office at 3. Conrad brought the folder. The Carlu was dressed in winter light, the tall windows along the hall threaded with the glow of chandeliers that cast everything in a warm, expensive amber. 300 people filled the room, partners, clients, contractors, spouses. The bar was open, the canapés were being circulated, and the noise of a successful firm celebrating itself filled every corner. Theo was at the center of it. He had been holding court near the bar for an hour, relaxed and expansive, his hand resting on the small of Mara's back in the proprietary way he sometimes had. Mara stood beside him in the green dress with a glass of sparkling water, smiling when addressed and watching the room in the way a person watches a room when they are waiting for something they cannot name. Conrad arrived at 7:45. He was wearing a dark gray suit and did not carry a cane, though his left hip had been troubling him for 2 years. He moved through the room without drawing attention, nodded to David across the crowd, and found a place at the edge of the hall near the windows, where he could see the head table clearly. David Alderton took the stage at 8. He was a compact, deliberate man who had built a company from a 2-person office in Etobicoke to a firm with 400 employees. He did not give flowery speeches. He said what needed to be said and he sat down. He began with the Hamilton project. He described it as a milestone for the firm, a testament to the quality of work that Alderton had always stood for. He spoke about the rigor of the bid process, the importance of integrity in procurement, the trust that municipal partners placed in Alderton's work. Theo straightened slightly in his chair. He reached for his wine glass. "Before I make the evening's announcement," David said, and his tone shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming the specific flatness of a man keeping himself very controlled. "I want to address something that came to my attention today, something that required us to make a significant change to tonight's program." The room went quiet with the particular attention of people who sense that something is about to go wrong for someone in the room, and do not yet know who. "Alderton Group has built this firm on 2 things, David continued, quality of work and integrity of character. When either of those is compromised, we have an obligation to respond. We learned today that the materials costings on the Hamilton bid were manipulated to divert funds to a fictitious subcontractor. The funds traced to an account held by the individual who was to have been recognized tonight." Theo went still, not a natural stillness, a frozen one, the kind that precedes a very bad moment. Mara, sitting beside him, slowly set her water glass down. "I am not going to name the individual here," David said, "because this will be handled by the appropriate authorities, and because there are people in this room who deserve better than to have their evening turned into a spectacle." He looked up. His eyes found Theo's table for exactly 1 second. "But I want this room to know that the promotion announcement has been withdrawn. I want our clients and our municipal partners to know that we found this ourselves, and we are addressing it ourselves, and we will cooperate fully with any investigation." David stepped back from the microphone. The room was very quiet for several seconds. Then Mara turned to look at her husband. Theo was already looking at her. His face had gone the color of old paper. His mouth was open slightly, as if the beginning of a denial was there but had no form yet. "Theo," she said, and her voice was not angry. It was the voice of someone who has been standing at the edge of a known truth for a long time and has finally stepped over the line. "What did you do?" He started to speak. "Mara, listen, this is not what it—" and then he stopped, because Conrad was walking toward the table. Conrad moved without urgency. He walked the length of the hall with the calm of a man who has already done the hard work and is simply here for the conclusion. He reached the table and pulled out the empty chair beside Mara and sat down. He placed his hands on the table, folded. He did not look at Theo, he looked at his daughter. "Do you want to go home?" he asked her. Mara looked at Ellie's photograph on her phone lock screen. She looked at her husband's face, she looked at her father. "Yes," she said. She picked up her bag, she stood. She walked out of the Carlu with Conrad beside her, and neither of them looked back. Theo sat alone at the table as the room very slowly resumed its noise around him, and the isolation of it. The 300 people who were no longer looking at him, because he had become the kind of person you look away from, was its own particular verdict. The months that followed moved the way hard things do. Not quickly, not cleanly, but forward. The RCMP commercial crime section opened a file. Bernadette's documentation, supplemented by Alderton's internal audit team, produced a case that the Crown prosecutor described as unusually well organized. Theo's lawyer, a man Theo could no longer fully afford, counseled him to consider a plea arrangement. Theo spent a month insisting he would fight it. Then the discovery phase began and he stopped insisting. Fiona, whose name Mara eventually learned from the hotel's billing records during the divorce proceedings, had nothing further to offer the story. She had moved to Vancouver in December. She left no note. The divorce was filed by Mara in January. Theo did not contest the custody arrangement. He was in no position to, and his lawyer made sure he understood that. Ellie stayed in the house in Leaside with her mother. She continued collecting rocks from the Credit River. She asked about her father sometimes, in the careful way that 4-year-olds ask about things they sense are complicated, and Mara answered her with honesty calibrated for her age, and kindness calibrated for the rest of her life. Theo entered a guilty plea in March. The sentencing hearing was held on a Wednesday morning, at the Ontario Court of Justice on University Avenue. The courtroom was not full. Corporate fraud hearings rarely attract crowds. But Conrad was there, and Mara's sister was there, and a representative from Alderton Group was there, and a reporter from the Globe who had been covering the Hamilton procurement story sat in the gallery with a notebook. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Maureen Adesanya. She had been on the bench for 16 years. She was known, in legal circles, for the quality of her sentences, not for their length, but for their precision. She had a way of addressing defendants that left them with very little room to hide behind the words they had prepared. She looked at Theo over the top of her reading glasses for a long moment before she spoke. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "you are being sentenced today for fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and uttering forged documents. Taken together, these offenses represent a sustained and deliberate betrayal of your employer, your professional obligations, and the public interest." Theo stood at the defense table. He was wearing his good suit, the one he'd worn to the Carlu. It didn't look the same on him now. "I note," Judge Adesanya continued, "that the Crown has also filed a victim impact statement from your former employer. I note that there are no mitigating factors related to financial need. You were well compensated. You chose to steal anyway, because you believed you could construct a life that the rest of your life was quietly funding." She paused. "That is not ambition, that is consumption." The courtroom was very quiet. "I sentence you to 30 months in a federal institution, to be followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You will make full restitution to Alderton Group in the amount determined by the civil proceeding. Your professional certifications are referred to the relevant regulatory body for review." The gavel came down. Theo was led out through the side door. He looked back once, toward the gallery, as if looking for someone. Conrad was looking at the judge. Mara was not there. She had chosen not to be, and that choice had been its own kind of statement. On the Saturday after the sentencing, Conrad drove to Leaside. He brought a bag of groceries. Things Ellie liked, apple slices and the small cheddar crackers, and a carton of that specific orange juice she requested. And Mara let him in and they sat in the kitchen, while Ellie played with her rocks on the living room floor, narrating something to herself in the focused, private way of small children. Conrad made tea. They talked about the garden, about Mara's plan to return to work full-time in the spring, about whether the south-facing window in the kitchen got enough light for herbs. They talked the way people talk when they are not ready to talk about the real thing, and they did it long enough that the real thing became easier. "I'm not okay," Mara said eventually. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not okay, and I'm not going to pretend that this is the ending I would have chosen." "I know," Conrad said. "But I'm also not broken," she said. "That's the thing I want you to know. I'm not broken." Conrad looked at her across the table. He thought about the night he had driven to Sunnybrook, without changing his clothes, and about the girl in the hospital bay with the IV in her arm. and about the folder on his desk that he had built in the months after. He thought about all the things he had not said out loud because the right time for them had not come. "I know that too," he said. "I never thought you were." From the living room, Ellie's voice rose with the specific brightness of a child who has found the rock she was looking for. "Papa, come look. This one has a stripe on it." Conrad pushed back from the table. He walked into the living room and sat on the floor beside his granddaughter and examined the rock with the seriousness it deserved. Mara stayed at the kitchen table for a moment, holding her tea. Through the window the February light was thin and cold and honest, the way winter light in Ontario is, unornamented, clear, showing things exactly as they are. She thought about the 4 unanswered texts. She thought about the hospital hallway and Sandra's shoulder beside hers on the linoleum floor. She thought about the green dress that she had since donated to a bin on Bayview. And about Ellie's voice saying, "It looks like a forest, Mama," and about the particular silence of a room where a man's life is being accurately described to him for the first time. She thought that there was no version of this that she would call justice. Justice was too clean a word for it. What she had was something smaller and more real. The knowledge that she had not looked away, that her father had not looked away, that the truth had been followed to its end, and that the other side of that end was just her life. Continuing. Reoriented. Ellie laughed in the living room, and Conrad laughed too, and the sound moved through the house like the first sign of something returning. Mara set down her tea. She got up and went to join them.